It's Survey Program, a podcast about Deltarunes, Season 2. We're continuing the Chapter 5 era with a follow-up to 2 of our Season 1 episodes, which we'll discuss in the show itself. Fantastic news. Thanks to your support, we've passed 900 subscribers on YouTube. I don't even know how many subscribers we got on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thanks so much for all the incredible support. I really love all the discussions that have come out of the Chapter 5 release, and you can join the Discord if you want to talk a little bit more about the show in more detail. We've got brand new music for Season 2 by show musician Highwell. You can check the Bandcamp link in the description for more. We're talking about trans stuff this episode. I know that can often provoke heated reactions or highly personal feelings, and all I can say is we can't cover every possibility or every eventuality in 1 hour, and so I hope that you approach this subject with the spirit of understanding that it was made in. And we do talk a little bit at the end about some of the common objections or discomfort that people might have with these types of trans readings. Of course, there's more context in our previous 2 episodes on the subject as well. All that said, enjoy the show. And a note, our lovely bird Pomeroy is very excited to be part of the podcast recording in the first few minutes. Don't worry, he's not that loud the whole episode. All right, Girona. I think the most important thing about the pink fight, the most significant thing, is the confirmation that Muffet is a thing in Deltarune.
I don't give a fuck about Muffet. It's
Gingus.
Slop.
Hey!
People, the lowest common denominator. Slop.
People keep coming on my show and making me have to censor things.
Censor what?
No.
Slop. It's
Gingus.
not a basic Deltarune word. It is, isn't it? What did you think I meant? She's a gastro.
No.
She has no connection with Gaster.
Well,
This is terrible.
get a chance.
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 This is terrible.
Get a
This
chance.
is terrible.
Get a glue.
This is terrible.
Girona.
This sucks. Okay, so this Mysterious Wind. This is a sequel. When you're doing Mysterious Wind, you have to do like a bad Bob Dylan impression.
That's what I did.
Yeah,
I said
no.
Mysterious Wind.
Mysterious Wind. So this is a sequel to 2 different episodes, and Palm is here again as he was in those 2 episodes. So on episode 6, we talked about transness in Deltarune, specifically Kris being a transgender character,
yes.
Right? And then we followed it up in episode 17 to talk about Metaton, to talk about MEW MEW in Undertale, and talk in general about how transness and gender are depicted, and the actualization of self-identity is depicted primarily in Undertale, with some thought looking forward to Deltarune. And we do have a loud bird.
Hey there, little guy.
And so we got a ton of stuff to follow up on that, I would say,
yes.
With Chapter 5. So I want to sort of start from the top and think about, what we learned from Deltarune Chapter 5 as regards gender. But first off, before we get into anything, Valerie, since, this is just our second episode after Chapter 5's release, how'd you find Chapter 5? Did you like it?
I really like Chapter 5. I like Chapter 5. I wish the tone was a little bit stronger, but I really like the weird route that we're not going to talk about in depth.
Yeah.
I really liked that. I liked the mechanics. I liked Pink quite a lot. I really liked Pink. And I like the flowers very much, obviously, but the Girona ing. So, which kind of just sounds like, I don't know, I didn't really like it, but I liked all these elements. I did like the chapter quite a lot. It's probably top 3 for me.
Yeah.
Along with 4 and 3, or 3 and 2. I quite liked it.
Yeah, I know people. Here's the thing: it does seem to me like this. The idea is basically that tonally, this is going to be a sort of like. I saw somebody say it's like giving a dog chocolate before putting it down, but it's like tonally, it's between Chapter 4 and what presumably will be a very serious chapter ahead and a very serious conclusion to the game ahead. And so, I do think that. Maybe it's a little bit frustrating in the context of
Chapter 4.
Of Chapter 4, which represented like an emotional escalation of stakes, right? To have a sort of return to the quote-unquote formula for Chapter 5. And I know that for people who are like big like lore heads, this was probably frustrating because we're sort of in the same place as regards, as I said last week, to the like image friend Gaster des Medias of it all. Like,
yes,
you know,
it does end with the best gut punch of the game so far, best non-weird brow gut punch of the game so far. So I think that does a lot for the game.
Kris fans be like, I love when Kris suffers.
Yeah, it's true.
And yeah, so I'm quite pleased with it, you know, as a series of character studies, and as someone who's like lorehead activity like leans towards, oh, I wish I would have been able to see a representation of the six fallen humans one day, and then we did actually get to see that, so I was super pleased with that. You know, a lot of Undertale nostalgia throughout the chapter, but I absolutely, you know, I did really like it, and you know, thinking about one of the first indications of like that we talked about in our previous Kris episode, talking about, you know, how the closet in their Dark World room in Castletown, you know, you could wear whatever you want, was sort of that first expression that there's a desire for self-expression that Kris has been holding back on, right? Yeah. That could be indulged in or escaped to in the Dark World, and now there's actually an additional interaction with that scene. And so if you interact with that closet again, there are all sorts of clothes. You could wear anything you want: top hats, ribbons, shirts, gowns, shorts, pants, a scuba outfit. And Susie says, like what, Ralsei? You think Kris is going to play dress up? And Ralsei says, if they want to. I just thought, isn't it nice to have some customization? And then that follow-up, if you check it again, there are all sorts of clothes. You can wear anything you want. And then it says, or even end up wearing anything you didn't want, which I think is that first, that is pairs well, I think, with the, like, these clothes have no power over you anymore, you know, conversation about the hand-me-down church clothes in chapter 4.
Yes.
As, like, you know, expressing not just that Kris has some desire for self-expression that has been repressed so far, but also that Kris does end up wearing things that they don't want frequently, yes. Right? And that's interesting, isn't it?
That Kris doesn't like wearing these male clothes.
Yeah.
Maybe because they're hand-me-downs, but I think more likely because they are not comfortable with them or wearing them.
Yeah.
I knew you had a charted path through this segment, but I'm gonna actually take you off road here because I think this is more interesting.
The purpose of my guests is to derail all my plans.
Absolutely. So I think that's interesting in the vein of wearing what they want. That in chapter 5 they do wear a skirt for the first time twice.
Yes.
Three skirts.
There's 3 skirts. Well, there's 2 skirts and Aqua's dress as well that they wear over the course of the chapter.
Yeah, which is incredible. That's really interesting. I think.
Yes, and I, you know, and it is interesting, and I think it represents a pretty significant escalation in Kris's style and presentation, right? Because we had seen them sort of wearing, you know, more expressive fashion and more androgynous fashion in the Dark World than their Light World expression had ever allowed previously, right? But we are seeing now a full-on indulgence of femininity throughout various acts now, right? Previously, their nurse outfit, you know, that was paired with the doctor outfit in the Take Care act, you know, there were pants. The waiter outfit in the, you know, that had heels, but there were pants. The rock star outfit, you know, was kind of glam rock. It was kind of androgynous in, like, the glam rock sort of way. Yeah. Which I think is, for many people, a safe first way to explore, you know, gender non-conforming status, right? Is that sort of glam rock androgyny. And, you know, that Kris has heels in that outfit, but is still, like, sort of performing, like, you know, Def Leppard type, you know, androgyny.
I think to touch on a sort of core point from the last episode that we did, on this one, just to reiterate the importance of what we're talking about here in regards to a trans feminine specifically reading of Kris, is that I think that if you think that what Kris is wearing in the Light World is something that they're happy with, is something that they're comfortable with, like wearing their brother's hand-me-downs, that you need to play the game again, or like look at the text dump or something. Like, this is not a kid that is like happy or comfortable with what they have to wear. Yeah. And I think the game with the blue closet is like, it's grabbing you by the shoulders, it's screaming at you, it's saying Kris likes to wear whatever they want. They like that they can wear whatever they want in the Dark World, which necessarily implies it's negative, right?
Yeah.
Like, the statement implies the opposite, which is that in the light world they can't wear whatever they want. In the dark world they can. And it's really interesting that they are increasingly maybe wearing more and more feminine clothing. I think that's really interesting. I'm not saying that, like, in chapter 6, if there is a dark world as such, or if it's so simple, Kris is only going to wear feminine clothing. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't wear any skirt. But, like, I think the momentum, the direction is really interesting.
Yeah, and, notably, these outfits are all paired with multiple options, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that expanding their presentation hasn't come at the expense of,
Yes, they are non-binary.
Yes, right. Kris is non-binary, right?
Yes.
And I think people need to understand that when you're arguing that there's a strong textual basis to say that Kris is trans-feminine, non-binary,
yes,
it's an attempt to socially ground. Again, we're retreading. This is a bit of a restatement, but many people who are listening might not have listened to our previous episode.
Yes.
And so just want to get this out here and say it's not erasure of someone's non-binary identity to try to socially ground it in something real, especially since the flowers, being humans of various genders does I think obliterate that and hometown having this very strong, like, gender binary based king and queen homecoming system.
Yes.
Does very strongly signpost that yes, there is a gender binary in this world. The absurd idea that all humans are somehow non-binary and Undertale and Deltarune is dumb. That Kris is purposefully non-binary, which comes from a social basis and has a personal history to their character.
Yes, Kris is non-binary.
Yes.
Kris, I do not think, was born non-binary, because
Yeah.
nobody is, because it's a deeply gendered world that
Yes.
Kris inhabits. And when we say trans-feminine, we mean moving from maleness towards not maleness.
Yes.
It's as simple as that, right?
And also not being able to actualize that in the light world, because
Yes.
they are not an actualized person in the light world, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Their presentation is much more masculine leaning because, their mother can't afford new clothes for them, right? So they're just wearing their brother's clothes, and, like, they don't have a room that's decorated. Like, if you're, like, there's no argument that Kris is a fully actualized person who is living like they want to in the light world.
Yes.
It's just not a thing.
Yeah.
But the dark world tempts people with the ability to actualize themselves.
They can wear whatever they want.
They can wear whatever they want. Folks, isn't it great?
Isn't it great?
But what we didn't touch on much in our previous episode was we were still kicking around the ambiguity of what Ralsei may represent, right?
Yeah.
And this was a huge, huge chapter for Ralsei. I would say just as chapter 4 was a character study of Susie and a development of Susie's character into the next phase, chapter 5 was a character study of Ralsei.
Yeah.
And the main boss figure, like Gerson was to Susie, Flowery is a sort of a challenger and a mentor to Ralsei. And one of those elements is a significant development of Ralsei's wants, desires, and presentation as a character, right? And so I think it's really, really notable that when Ralsei first appears in chapter 5, he first emerges out of the identical sprite of the blue closet from Kris's Castletown bedroom.
Yes.
Where and where Flowery had shoved them in the closet, as sort of, and Flowery throughout the chapter sort of makes many pointed references to, aren't you hiding something? Aren't you holding something back? Aren't you not embracing who you want to be? Right? And so people talk about this and they say, well, of course, because Ralsei has secrets. Ralsei has capital L lore, capital S secrets, right? And, Ralsei is holding back spells and holding back, and adhering to their role in the story. And all I can say is things are metaphors for other things. You know what I mean?
Sure,
That
layers.
Exactly. And that discomfort that Ralsei feels with his prophesized role in the story, with his title as prince, and with his gender presentation, and with his holding back his nature as a game-breaking figure, as an impossibility. This is all tied together. Things mean things in Deltarune. This is the fundamental argument, is that Deltarune is about things other than just video games.
Yeah, it's true. It's not about the act of playing games.
It's partially about that, but in the same way that, like...
That's not the only thing it's about.
Yeah. In the same way that, like, Asteroid City is a movie about movies in some ways, but it doesn't mean that it's not about life as well and trying to navigate your own identity. And so there's a number of things like And I do want to talk. I want to talk about Ralsei here specifically because we did talk a while back about Ralsei, and there was a great video essay by Stuffed Alpaca that actually sort of called the shot of where Ralsei's character would be going in Chapter 5, and talking about that discomfort with the prince, being the prince in the dark. And I will say, I'll link that again because that's one of the best. That's one of the like Chapter 3-4 era videos that holds up the best. That really got validated by this new chapter coming out.
Yeah. That
there would be something going on with Ralsei's gender. And I think really, really critically, like the biggest scene here is when there's a scene later on where Ralsei there's a choice between drinks at the diner, and Flowery is confronting Ralsei one-on-one in one of their many conversations where Flowery is sort of teasingly, sort of tauntingly, sort of aloofly, right, sort of trying to tease Ralsei into actualizing themselves, and says, you wanted to try this one, right? Blue and pink. And Ralsei says, no, how did you know that? Flowery says, you were looking at it the longest. Just get your fave and don't worry about Kris. Got it, princess? And so this is, I think, the biggest possible flashing signpost light you could ever have for what the fuck is going on here. Like, that it's, that they're being asked to choose a blue and pink beverage.
Yes.
And being called princess, which makes them blush and sort of scowl in a, you've seen me way.
Yes, and more poignantly, they have their pronouns set to they.
And exactly. Right after that, their title on the stat screen says, watering their own thorns. Editor note here, yes, I know this switch doesn't happen immediately after this scene. It's after you finish climbing the beanstalk right after, but come on.
Yes.
Which, is the first reference, and not the last. There's another one in this chapter of Ralsei with they, them pronouns.
Yes. So, okay, enough about Ralsei. We're talking about Kris. What does this matter to Kris? That's the crux of this episode. How does this matter to Kris's character? You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting because Ralsei takes a sip of that. Ralsei offers Kris a sip of that blue and pink beverage, even though
yes.
Even though they've also drank it,
they
right?
Share it.
But no, there's one point that I really want to critically make before we move on. I want to say that and I want to talk about this because you know this, because Flowery's a good guy. Because Flowery
is a hero.
Flowery is a hero. In this house, Flowery's a hero. Flowery does nothing. Flowery's motivations are noble. Yes. Flowery is a hero. Flowery does the right thing.
He does nothing wrong.
And so, if your argument here is that this isn't supposed to be, indicating that Ralsei has some acceptance to make about embracing femininity, about embracing, fluidity of gender, right? And
yes.
Fluidity of presentation, then your argument fundamentally is Flowery was being transmisogynistic there.
Yes.
Which doesn't match with any of his behavior in any of the rest of the chapter.
Absolutely.
And not only that, and to bring this back to Kris, Flowery calls the party princesses.
Yes, do a quick sidebar.
Yeah.
There's 2 times where Flowery unambiguously refers to the whole party as princess or princesses. And I think that's really interesting because this is a flower that has known Kris for their entire life.
Yeah.
This is a flower from the wedding bouquet, right?
Yeah.
All of the flowers are from the wedding bouquet.
Yeah.
This is a flower that has known Kris his entire life,
yeah.
right? His being Flowery,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And has known Kris since Kris is a little baby, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that Flowery would refer to Kris as a princess if that's like that would be like an upsetting misgendering, right? Yeah, like a reversal, a misgendering or degendering Kris. Like,
yeah.
I don't think Flowery would be doing that.
Yeah.
Flowery's a good guy.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's really important, is that Flowery is a good flower.
Yeah.
Flowery was a hero.
Yeah.
When Flowery is pushing Ralsei, it's like a little bit teasing, but it's good.
Yeah.
It's ultimately very good. And most of Flowery's interactions with the fun gang, the fuck gang.
The Lancer fan club.
The Lancer fan club in this chapter are, like, mostly aimed towards Ralsei, right?
Yeah.
But I think this is really revealing how he refers to the whole group, especially. Yeah. But what does Ralsei being trans mean to Kris? What does Ralsei's trans femininity mean to Kris?
And we talked a little bit about this previously because, Kris initially seems to regard Ralsei with some reticence, or at least based on, some of the tea healing titles, Kris has grown fonder of Ralsei over time, right? And their interactions have gotten friendlier, even potentially romantic and more intimate over time, right? Yeah. And there has been a budding positivity. And I think it's really critical to note as well that Kris's first times being depicted wearing skirts in actions here are alongside Ralsei also doing the same thing.
That's true.
Right?
I think, I don't want to get too bogged down in the metaphysics of discussing what Ralsei represents counter to Kris. Because I have some thoughts, but they're not completely developed enough that I want to present them. I think that it can be understood that Ralsei is a reflection of Kris. Yeah. On what level? In the lore sense, it's not relevant. Yeah. But Ralsei is a reflection of Kris. I kind of think that Ralsei is Kris's childhood male persona. I think that's a pretty popular theory. That's my soft theory, right? But Ralsei represents a parallel to Kris in that sense, right? Yeah. So when Ralsei makes progress and Kris doesn't, that's interesting. Yes. Right? As when Ralsei as a character progresses, in the same way that when Susie as a character progresses and Ralsei and Kris don't, that was interesting, right? Yes. But when Ralsei's making progress, it makes you think, what's going to happen in chapter 6, but also, what is Kris holding back?
And that's really critical, because you were talking about the ending, and it now feels like Susie and Ralsei have both progressed, right? Yeah. They've both embraced these new roles. They've both found new meaning in this story, and Kris is left behind in a lot of ways, right? Kris is clearly unhappy about that. I mean, the ending, the credit sequence is Kris being left behind as Susie and Ralsei embrace this new role and new purpose with each other, and Kris is standing there dejected alone in the hallway. Yeah, and
they got no one, bro.
Yeah, yeah,
just them and Des.
Yeah, who is whatever you regard, it's obvious that the role that Kris has in working with the Knight is not super happy. It's certainly not, it's out of guilt and obligation. I don't think it's out of a a great amount of personal positivity. Yeah. And you're right too that answering literally what is Ralsei is unanswerable at this point, and I think mostly uninteresting because we simply don't have enough information to say. But asking what does Ralsei represent is pretty clearly tied to Kris in a very strong way, right? And so that development is fascinating, and to see Ralsei breaking free of that fated role as the prince, while Kris is still shackled to the collaboration with the Knight and moving the plot forward, is the core conflict that's set up moving forward.
Yeah, I think that Kris is someone who is, this is kind of obvious, but is deeply repressed. Yeah. And I think that that repression extends to, the psychological, I don't think it, like many things in Deltarune, because it's a work of art, things work on multiple layers, multiple levels. There's the literal and there's, various ways that it shines through a character in different ways.
And as we talked about in our previous chapter where we did an extended discussion on both Man Country and the Chapter 4 Art Therapy Egg Room.
Man Country so much.
Yes. We talked a little bit about how it's pretty clear that Kris had interactions with youth psychological, the youth psychological system. And our theory and many people's theory is that the Forgotten Man was either literally Kris's therapist, formally Kris's therapist, or a mentor figure that has disappeared and been forgotten from the world, right, for Kris. Yep. And the Chapter 5, so just a little bit of talk about the Chapter 5 Egg Room. It does feel like there is a mournfulness to the Forgotten Man's absence. And again, it reiterates that the Forgotten Man doesn't appear to have been a negative influence on Kris, right? No. And that actually Kris is even more repressed now that this positive outlet for them has disappeared. Yeah. And interestingly, there is another reference to the Chapter 3 Egg Room to Man Country, and pairing it again with Kris's gender presentation in one of the lines that the enemy Shiri, the pair of garden shears, says, which is, Kris, short hair, long hair, nowhere, where nowhere is the gray area that you can see from Man Country, through the binoculars.
Yep.
And so again, it ties these questions of Kris's presentation to Man Country again in a way that I think is a great signpost just for saying, like, yes, you can treat these as intrinsically tied to one another. That signpost of non-men or AOK too being in that place that's called back to again. And so I think that's useful. And bringing it back to the Metaton episode,
Yay.
for our, as we pivot here, bringing it back to the Metaton episode, we talked about the ghosts, right? We had the ghost narratives in Undertale, and talking about transness in Undertale. We had a trio of ghosts that represented cisness, that represented transmasculinity, and represented transfemininity,
yes.
right? Yes. And we used Napstablook as an example of a distinction between a character who uses they, them pronouns but is not non-binary in a meaningful social sense, to contrast with Kris, who uses they, them pronouns and is non-binary in a meaningful social sense, something that was reiterated by the constant emphasis to the gender binary in the festival, right? In the, in the social structure of hometown, and with the flowers having defined gender roles that, for example, Seth has some discomfort trying to fit in and define themselves in. And so, that's, so that's, I think Napstablook is a great signpost for, that's a cis non-binary character, which is hilarious.
Yes.
And of course, Metaton, transmasculine, right? And Undertale, and one of the big items that was a big flashing light of, trans narratives are very deliberately told in Undertale and Deltarune, is that basically the only major change ever made to Undertale was the addition on Switch release of an explicit trans feminine story that is about reconciling with dysphoria in Mad Mew Mew. And, in my wildest dreams, I was like, it would be so nice to see Mad Mew Mew again, to see Maddie, and to see that trans femininity again, because, other than the waitress lion, we don't really have that same amount of explicit side character trans femme representation so far. And then it happened! It fucking happened! It's like my Super Bowl, dude! It's unbelievable!
Yay.
And so your first hint, so you do see the Mew Mew figurine outside the shop before in the morning of the festival, and you can talk to Maddie in the house and see that Maddie is fixated on the doll, on the Mew Mew doll.
She's creeping in,
and she's been creeping in to Asgore's shop.
Creeping on your dad.
She's been creeping on your dad. This is. I'm sorry, Kris. There's been some characters that want to.
They want to be with your dad.
Yeah, there's some characters. There's both Flowery and Pink want to fuck your dad. Sorry. But you first encounter this figure that you realize is probably Maddie by the triple repetition of words when you get to the shop in chapter 5. A shop, by the way, notably that Kris plays the theme of on the piano. Isn't that interesting?
That is really interesting.
Yeah, in chapter 4, despite having not encountered the character yet. I don't know how much of that is diegetic or not, but it is interesting. I mean, we previously talked about it as, Kris having played Rule's card theme as evidence that Kris doesn't really dislike Rules that much, which is funny. Yeah. But, it was also interesting they play the Pink Shop theme.
Yeah.
But anyway, you encounter this character, this sort of cat girl character in the shop before knowing who the secret boss is or anything about that. And they have that triple word repetition, and I think eagle-eyed watchers would be like, "Oh shit, that's Maddie!" Already, that's the pink ghost, that's Mad Mew Mew. But she has a couple really interesting lines in that shop, and I want to talk about first one. Listen, have you had ears before? Cute and fluffy ears? You should try it. Yes, you're nodding. Obviously, you agree.
Yes.
Obviously. And this is another explicit reference to Kris being dysphoric and wanting to change their body.
Yes.
Right? And
they want to change their shape.
Yes. And to put that in the mouth of a transfeminine character, of a textually transfeminine character, and have that moment of bonding with Kris is, I think, really, really important. I haven't gotten to any of the like full on secret the boss fight stuff yet, right? But there's another element later. There is another textual parallel between Kris and Pink later on as well that I want to talk about. But when you're having this conversation as well, you ask about her name, and she says, names, names, names. That's what everyone always thinks about. But what defines you is, well, it's your body, isn't it?
Yeah. Which is so cool.
Yeah.
So cool, because I think a lot of what Kris does in this chapter is defined by, like, a lot of the stuff in the periphery is defined by, like, an inability to affect change on their body. Like, an inability to do magic as well. It's something that Aqua points out constantly. Like, why can't you do magic? Lol. Right?
Yeah.
And Kris is unable to, like, change themselves, like, easily and conveniently, right? Like, in the conversation with Aqua, you do a bunch of, like, goofy outfits. But that's not really changing, right?
Yeah.
That's not using magic. You're not changing your body. You're not changing yourself fundamentally. You have to use, like, rather mundane and complex means to, like, change.
Yeah.
Which is just dressing differently.
Yeah.
You know? And it's embarrassing and weird.
Yeah.
But, which it resembles to me as well, resembles the way that Maddie has to change her body.
Yeah.
Because Maddie, as a ghost, Pink, as a silly ghost, doesn't have an easy method of changing her body. She has to, like, possess another body, which is kind of like wearing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once you collect the pink coins and you buy the key, you get to actually encounter Pink outside of the shop. Pink is pretending to be one of the other flowers, but is actually, the ghost possessing the Mew Mew doll that is in Asgore's shop that has been animated into a darkener by the Dark World, right? And this is a really interesting thing, because as this fight progresses, you realize that there's just like in the Mew Mew fight in Undertale, right? There's a disconnect between the body and the mind, right? In the Mew Mew fight, you're watching Maddie try to reconcile herself with her new body in a way that is extremely obviously a dysphoria metaphor.
Yes.
And this happens again. This is so important that it gets reiterated again.
Yes. I think it's really interesting that Kris and Maddie are both unable to affect substantial change on their body, on their forms, in the light world.
Yeah.
And it requires the dark world for them to enact this fantasy, to live out the fantasy of changing themselves more substantially than, like, Susie or Noelle change themselves, really. Like, Susie just kind of, like, looks cooler and swings an axe around, right?
Yeah.
But, like, doesn't substantially change herself. But Kris does substantially, pointedly change themselves. And Maddie obviously changes herself, right? And both of them do this and then encounter a complication to doing this. It's never quite so simple, right?
Yeah.
They both encounter blocks towards changing their body. With Maddie being, of course, the split between soul and body, and Kris being, like, a multi-pronged thing, I think. Like, both the split between their self and their soul, right? And themself and, like, Ralsei as these potential sites of conflict going into the next chapter. But a complication, nonetheless, that they encounter early in the chapters and aren't really happy with.
And we skipped, to save it for now, one of the earliest and most impactful pieces of narration in this chapter, which is right at the start. When you check the mirror, after starting this, Kris looks in the mirror and you get the text, "Your eyes wander over the face in the mirror. You quickly look away. Who is that?" And this is brought back again in the Pink fight with the explicitly mirrored flavor text. Pink stares at a mirror. She doesn't turn around.
Yes.
Kris,
so cool.
Kris and Pink are explicitly tied together in this way.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a third tie-in as well, which is, as you may recall, we talked about previously, Kris reacting in horror, shouting, sweating, clearly upset at having encountered Spamton in Spamton Neo in chapter 2, and Spamton's inability to change his body, right? Yeah. And Spamton's puppet strings and trapped nature, right? Spamton says, one of his lines is, he wants to be a real boy. Cut that wire and make me a real boy. And one of Pink's lines is, I want to be a normal girl. And that's so interesting, isn't it?
I think that it's really interesting. At risk of like reaching a little bit here, it's absolutely fascinating that Kris has this much of a response to Spamton, who I think of as kind of like a totemic like symbol of just grotesque washed up masculinity.
Yeah.
Like I don't think it's a coincidence that like I think fans interpret him as like a 1 foot tall greasy Italian man, right? Like he's like, because I think this is informed by like obviously the Hachimama, like kind of language, but also the way that he encourages Kris to be like a man in the weird route. Right?
Yeah.
Encourages Kris to like put a ring on that lady type shit,
Yeah.
I think that Spamton symbolizes like this like grotesque failure to reach outside of like your body, to like substantially to cut the strings in your puppet, right? I think it's like is a site of grotesque masculinity in this sense, and of like I think,
but wasn't always.
There
was a peak period where Spamton had a period of defining himself, right, and reached a high point of self-actualization where he was a handsome, famous figure who had a show with Tenna, right?
And I think Kris is desperately afraid, this is just my interpretation, is desperately afraid of becoming like Spamton. And that's sort of more obvious on the level of the puppet and the strings, right? That's the symbolic layer, right? I think that's the clear parallel to make. But I think, like on a physical level, right? On like a psychological level, Kris does not want to be Spamton.
Yes.
And Kris encounters Pink and it goes on a silly date.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that's really funny.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really funny.
Yeah.
Like, if you tried to make Kris go on like the same kind of date with Spamton, I think that they would take their heart out.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's fascinating, the difference. And obviously, like, when you say, like, whenever you indicate in text or enable Kris to, like, say, I don't actually want to go on a date with Pink, they do the little...
They give you a
like,
peace sign.
Yeah, so, like, I think they don't actually want to, but, like, they're not, like, viscerally opposed to it. They're just kind of having
chill.
fun.
Yeah, they're chill. They clearly don't have a problem being around Pink in the same way that they had a problem being around Spamton.
Yes.
Right? And I think that's very interesting. And to dig into Pink a little bit more as well, I think I want to talk a little bit about this actualization, right? And explicitly how this is brought up, coming back around to Pink and returning to this narrative beat from the Undertale Switch version and doing it again and making it even more strictly about the reconciliation of the self with the body.
Yeah.
Right? One of Ralsei's lines is, "Don't you think your body deserves a say too?" And Maddie was this shut-in who was stuck indoors, living in, only being able to actualize herself in fantasy or by creeping on Asgore. There's a real element of like her needing to find and understand the needs of her body to actually be able to actualize herself, right? And I think that's really, really fascinating. And I think it's an important message, and I want to be really clear about what I'm saying here, lest it be misinterpreted as me saying something transmedicalist or what have you, or gatekeepy or what have you. But what I want to say is that, to me, I feel like this really represents needing to find fulfillment. You need to be more than just a shut-in who thinks about being trans. Like, you have to find some way, whichever way works for you and your body and your, and your heart. You have to find some way to affect actual change and to live an actual life.
You can't just dwell in the fantasy.
Yeah.
And I think this is what the chapter has about.
Yeah.
You can't just live in the fantasy. You have to internalize the fantasy and carry it forward, right? If you want to be trans, like Maddie, right? You can't just like live in the dark world, right? It's not possible. It's not tenable. You have to internalize it, which I think she is doing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think when the light goes off, she doesn't stop. She emerges from the darkness changed.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really cool. I think that's really, really beautiful, because I don't think that the chapter and Maddie's fight is about a simple, literal conflict between a ghost and a plastic catgirl body. I think that the fight is about, and this is more poignant and applicable to Kris, a substantial conflict between you and your body.
Yeah.
Between the person and the body, right?
Yeah.
And in Chris's case, various things. The soul and their self, right? This kind of source of passion and inspiration, and like a body that just kind of wants to, like, it's kind of an inversion of Pink, right?
Yeah.
Because Pink has this ghost that doesn't want to do anything, that just wants to, you know, just wants to live in the fantasy, and this body that wants to, like, is effusive and wants to, like, flirt and go out, right?
Yeah, he wants to date and eat.
And Kris has an inversion.
Yeah.
Where Chris's soul is what gets Kris to do anything in the story. It's their source of passion. It's their source of inspiration on a very literal level. The soul controls Kris. The soul makes Kris move. Without the soul, Kris is a zombie.
Yeah, yeah, it's become even clearer that Kris cannot survive without the soul for very long, as Kris looks almost dead in the opening of this chapter without it.
And has trouble doing basic things.
And it is notable that Chris's biggest conflict and struggle with the soul in the normal route takes place within a closet. We talked about this last time already, but we're to return to closets again. Chris's biggest physical tussle with the soul takes place inside a closet. Yeah. An explicit mirror of the fight with Pink.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is interesting. I think that's worth thinking about, is this conflict between soul and body, right? And I think the parallel there between Kris and Pink is that you have to make peace with your body. You have to make peace with your passion. You have to, you know, if you want to become a whole person, you have to unite yourself as a person, you know?
And in a mirror to Ralsei's title changing after the interaction with Flowery, you know, Chris's title starts this chapter as Blue Rose, quiet yet flirtatious, which, by the way, holy Twin Peaks reference. Yeah. We'll do a Twin Peaks episode at some point, I would have to think. Mm-hmm. But their title changes to Pink Rose, flirtatious and flirtatious after the Pink fight, which is so interesting. And I find that really fascinating. And
there's just one more thing before you depart from the
Of course.
I loved the line. I just had this down in my notes. One of Pink's lines in this is, "Now I'm a sensation. I have friends, enemies, neutrals," which is like really funny as like a parallel to Kris in this. Right?
That's true. And the many varied alliances and rivalries that Kris has and is developing over the course of the game.
For sure.
And yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, all like many of like Jevil, Spamton, and now Pink are reflections of Kris in various ways, right? Yeah. And you know, these secret Jevil, so actually like Jevil, Eram, Spamton, and Pink are all reflections of Kris, right? We've seen reflections in various ways.
Yeah, like
and the Knight, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. But like with the soul and with Ralsei, if I think about like this kind of dual conflict with Pink and her body being split several ways, Kris with the soul and with Ralsei is able to do anything.
Yeah.
Right? They're with all of these disparate dysphoric elements united, they're able to flirt with anyone, dress however they want, you know. They're able to live, right?
Yeah.
Instead of rotting literally in dysphoria.
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And it's just like to repeat this point, to come back to this point and to tie it explicitly to Kris in so many ways is important. It's important. And again, this is just the point going back. Deltarune is a game with a transgender protagonist. Yeah. Deltarune is a game with a non-binary protagonist. This is important. This is not only important for Deltarune. This is important for Deltarune's place in the broader context of culture and in the history of video games. Yeah. Because I do genuinely think that Deltarune is a monumental step for mass culture with transgender characters in it. Much like 10 years ago, Undertale was a monumental step for mass culture with gay characters in it, and also trans characters.
But more implied.
Yes, but more implied. And now, you know, and again, to return to and make even more explicit one of the trans femme characters is hugely important. To not let it live at the level of subtextual or in the past or, you know, a console exclusive, but to say, I want to emphasize this again. Should be a sign to readers that you're paying attention. This is something to pay attention to.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I want to... So on this show, we try very hard not to just grind an axe against takes we don't like, right? That's
I'm being so restrained, guys.
Right. And that's one of the things that I try to guide. That, you know, that's one of my like house rules for the panel is I don't want to talk about what we don't like about what fans think as much as possible.
Yes.
But I do want to briefly bring up one of the most common moronic criticisms that people have of, transgender readings of characters in Deltarune. And it's, well, you're erasing representation for feminine men, so just a couple things on that I want to note, which is first, feminine men as a class are not facing a genocide are not facing an assault on their legal rights to exist, their ability to live as children and adults, or participate in various institutions of culture, in the United States, United Kingdom, and around the world. That is not a that while people who adhere to a binary gender but are non-conforming do face various social pressures and discrimination, it is not a meaningfully protected class compared to being transgender. And in fact, the discrimination that they face is downstream from transphobia and the enforcement of cis-normativity and gender. And so if you address transphobia, you also address the discrimination that non-conforming people, cis people face, right? Second, we seem to have gotten characters that we got Blue, who is a feminine man, who uses he/him pronouns, who has no dysphoria, who has no signposting of any sort of, trans status whatsoever, and is a wonderful character who is portrayed very positively and has a sweet love story in this chapter, right? And I think that's a deliberate contrast to show that, this kind of character can exist and can be happy in this world, right? And Susie as well Susie's so funny because we actually do get, I think about this a lot. In a world where Kris and Ralsei and, many of these other characters didn't exist, we would be talking about Susie so much in the context of gender and gendered readings of Deltarune. Because Susie is a very assertive and someone who is blazing her own journey of gender presentation as well, right? And she's doing it in a very confident way. And there's a moment of there's a bit of a swoon where she's challenged to wear ribbons, as the prophecy says she was supposed to, right? Yeah. And briefly tries it and then chooses to wear it in her own way. She wears it as an armband instead, right? And there's the chapter 4 Tea Party where she says, I always just had to be tough. And it's like she's learning how to navigate gender and, and present as, sort of as a more casual, masculine type woman, right? Without, and there's meaningful narratives of that in Deltarune too. And so I just want to address that because I just want people to understand that when you say that, when you say these things, you're actively being detrimental to the representation of trans people in fiction, and you're ignoring that Deltarune has other examples of what you're looking for with these characters. If the idea of transfemme Ralsei or analyzing Kris as an actual person with a personal history bothers you, I really want you to interrogate why instead of your first instinct being to jump down trans people's throats about it. That's all, okay? And so let's go back to the flowers. Let's go back to our lovely flowers and talk a little bit more. Yes.
I love the flowers so much.
And so I also want to talk about Aqua a little bit, right? Because Aqua is a very Kris-like character, who is, who carries many of the trappings of a little girl in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I've seen some people try to use that to say that, well, then obviously Kris was a little girl once too, right?
Seeing the character and almost treating it as an out of pocket fact. Just oh yeah, this is basically, and then internalizing it and then moving on with that as a base assumption, which I think is a little bit ridiculous.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, look, the pithy quick response to this is obviously yellow is a representation of Asgore's faults, his the dreamer family suicide gene, his passion for his single-minded focus on justice being to his own detriment and the detriment of those around him. And obviously, and then, in the cutscene, Toriel is blue, where, he's talking about his problems. He's yellow and Toriel is blue. And it's well, obviously, Toriel is not a gay black man. Right. And so, I do not think that the flowers are supposed to be one-to-one representations of people in Asgore's life with their fucking assigned gender at birth preserved.
Encoded into them at a base level. I don't think that's true.
Yes. I think really what it is interesting, it is interesting to see a character mirror Kris, aesthetically, with a fascination with knives. Yeah. And a fixation on play, too, which Iram taunts Kris with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, have them be, maybe another reflection of Kris, in some way. And, it's all, and also Kris gets to like wear their outfit in their, as one of the choices in the cafe scene with them too, right?
I feel like on some level, and this is not as... I feel like on some level that Aqua is kind of like what Kris wishes they could be. Which is like running around and stabbing like openly and very silly, right?
Yeah.
Instead of having to be like very shy about their whole knife thing.
Yeah, that's true. Blushing about the knife.
I don't think that Kris was running around with the knife like that much as a kid, probably.
Yeah.
I think that Ascor and Toriel probably would have stopped that.
Yeah.
I think Kris maybe wishes they could have.
Yeah.
That it could represent it in that way. I think we're probably going to have an episode on the flowers at some point. I think almost certainly to like talk about what they mean. But I think it's worth...
And I would want to bring that back to an Undertale context, too, as well. Of course,
yeah. So I will not be on that, because I'm not as much of a fan of the soul of the like the cosmology of Undertale Deltarune. However, I think it's worth talking about that for a little bit, because I feel like it's kind of like reached a critical mass of being taken as a fact,
Absolutely.
In Deltarune.
And and I've seen some people say, well, Kris's original soul must have been the cyan, the aqua-colored soul then as well. And it's like, that's sort of like the, the XKCD string theory comic of like, well, what does that mean? I don't know. Like, what does that mean? We don't, like, your thing doesn't have any idea. That doesn't tell me what to do. But also it's like, or the orange souls item in Undertale is the manly bandana, whereas in Deltarune, the orange flower is a small female mouse. Yeah. And it's like, I don't think that Agab is supposed to be carried on the soul level across universes. Yeah. And I think if your theory rests on that, it's just as bad as your theory being that Flowery is transphobic. like it just doesn't seem to square cosmologically with how this game works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looking through my notes here, I had a couple more things on Ralsei. And then we'll circle back to anything else you wanted to cover before the end. Yeah. So first off, Ralsei, I had a member of the panel was replaying Chapter 1 recently and mentioned that Ralsei is referred to as both a sweet basket of eggs and egg boy in Chapter 1.
What?
Yes, and so let's pin that alongside some of the egg symbolism.
Maybe, alongside Kris's egg hunt to reflect on their childhood.
Yes. And also that... and I think that's really interesting too. The egg hunt to reflect on their childhood therapist, and a little bit of a thought about one of the dialogues you can get on the when you're at the festival and you vote for Kris and Noelle. Noelle gets nostalgic about when they voted for each other when they were very young. And they had a quote is, "We couldn't even agree on who should be king or queen."
Which is so adorable.
Which first off is very adorable.
However,
it is interesting because first off, it does show that Kris was expressing discomfort with gender and was at least able to express that to Noelle at a young age.
Yes.
And that there was disagreement over that assigned and understood role between them.
Yeah, I think we can understand that the intention here, probably on like a basal level, is that Noelle, as a little girl, was confused as to why Kris wouldn't want to be the king.
Yes.
Right? I think that's like, to make it extremely obvious what I think is was happening there, is that there was some confusion there, right? They were arguing about that, which is really interesting, and I think, without going into it too much, I'll save this for another episode, I think reveals a lot about Noelle's, like, conflict with the gender dynamic between Kris and her.
Yeah.
Right? Where the weird route kind of shoves them into, like, a male and female role.
Yeah.
Where they are the bride and the groom.
Yeah.
Right? They are the king and the queen.
Yeah. And in many ways, the weird route is a return to childhood nostalgia or a twisted fulfillment of Noelle's childhood aspirations, right? And it is also interesting because, there's that king or queen dialogue is reflected in Seth as well, who does get a scene about explicitly being flustered about not fitting into the gendered expectations that other flowers may have. And they say, but the king or queen of this battle is blossoming before you right now. They refer to, when interrogated about whether they're a girl or a boy, get flustered over this and say, a real tactician never reveals any unnecessary information. And it's... And, they sort of hint and dance around it. And I think that's very interesting. And just, again, another example of this chapter being really awash in trans themes and, awash in themes of discomfort, of the discomfort that the imposition of the gender binary places on characters, not just in Hometown and in the light world, but even applying to the flowers as well, who are not fully darkners, right? They are, they're something in between.
Yeah.
And, just a lot of this game seems to be setting up this idea of discomfiting binaries, being something that's shackling people and trapping people in cycles. And, freedom may well be about breaking those binaries, and darkness being used to explore alternatives to the way that we currently live. And so I do wonder, and I try not to do, this is not a speculation, this is not a theory show.
No.
But it is interesting that for all of the happiness and all of the closeness that Kris has developed throughout this game, they're still adhering to the original plan. There is something so important to them that they're risking losing everything and alienating everyone to continue with this original plan, which is to envelop the world, which appears to be to work with the Roaring Night to envelop the world in darkness. So there must be something on offer for them. Is it purely blackmail? Is it not? This is a core mystery that we don't understand, right? But we saw even more in this chapter, both in the normal route and in the weird route, the frustrating limitations of Hometown, right? The imposition of gender binary, the frustration that it feels inescapable. We finally got to see a character call it a stupid town that they want to leave for the first time, right? Yeah. And so where is that heading? It's almost building up to make it understandable why someone would want to destroy it.
Yes, but worry not. Chairman Des is here to bring the gender revolution. Chairman Des is here to bring the dark fantasy. Chairman Des is here to expand the closet to everywhere. Everywhere is in the darkness of the closet, and you can be whatever you want as long as you stay in the dark. But you can do whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. You can dress however you want and however you don't want.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want. And I think Kris is ready to die for that cause. I think Kris is so fed up with Hometown and its restrictions and its complications and its drudgery that they're willing to just take it all. They're willing to do whatever it takes to live that fantasy forever.
Yeah. And the question then, really, it feels as though one of the core conflicts of this game is between indulging in your real self and actualizing yourself only in fantasy, or having a healthy balance of indulging yourself in fantasy, emerging changed from that, reconciling yourself with what's real and concrete, and finding your way back into the light as a changed person.
Absolutely.
Right?
You got to leave the closet at some point.
Yeah.
And at some point, Kris will.
Yeah. That's Survey Program. I'll see you in the outro. Thanks for listening. Next week, we flip over the disc and go to Side B. You can join the Discord. You can comment on YouTube. You can listen on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, if you want to chip in a little bit to help with hosting costs, $5 a month at groupastrike.net gets you access to our bonus episodes in the Green Room. Music's by Highwell. Check the Bandcamp link in the description.
And when the waves come crashing down on the shore, and when the leaves have fallen to a new shade of gray, and when the winter once again calls your name, I will be here waiting.
Group Strike Amalgamated General Productions GmbH